Welcome back, everybody. This is Neil Dailey, and on the call with me today is Rich Marshall with Connor and Winters, attorney on the subject today of Estoppel certificates. This is one of the most commonly asked questions, probably for an attorney, but certainly as a commercial real estate broker. When we see those in lease documents, especially to the uninitiated, what is an Estoppel certificate? Why do you need it? Why is this in here? Me as a tenant, why do I have to execute this during the lease term? And then you as an owner or landlord, why would you want that in there, and what does that do? So Rich, thank you very much for being on the call today. This is I think this is our fourth or fifth installment in these informational sessions. What is an Estoppel certificate?
Well, Neil, thanks for having me again. I'll read you what estoppel. It's a fancy word. It's from Webster's dictionary, but the word estoppel means a legal bar to alleging or denying a fact because of one's own previous actions or words to the contrary.
Okay, so a legal bar to alleging or denying a fact because of one's own previous actions or words to the contrary.
Yeah, so that's a big bunch of gobbledygook. But I think the way we can really sum it up is basically once you make a statement. So let's say the statement is rent for this property is $600 a month,
okay,
and that's what I'm paying. Once you make that statement in writing, it's hard to go back and assert something contrary to it. You are basically stopped, or you are prevented from trying to change what you've actually stated in your written statement. So that's really the purpose of the Estoppel certificate as a whole. It is really to provide. Let's use it in a purchase context. It's used to provide the buyer with a part of his diligence from the tenant, where the tenant basically is affirming to the buyer, hey, if you buy this property, I as the tenant are giving you these factual statements right now as being true and correct. The rent is X. My lease term is 6 months. I've got 3 renewal options of 5 years each. I've got a security deposit of $800. So the buyer uses that information as kind of a part of the diligence to get comfortable with the lease. Because what the buyer doesn't want to do is they don't want to buy the property and then all of a sudden have a tenant knock on their door and say, oh, hey, well, you still got to fix all these problems the landlord left, or didn't you know there's a dispute about rent, or didn't you know I already have a pending claim against the landlord for something else? So that's the whole purpose really of the estoppel. Is it just gives the buyer or a lender in a lending transaction just comfort as to what the tenant is seeing as the tenant sits in the lease.
I think it is also to the tenant's strength. So I've been on both sides of this before. So I've represented buyers buying office buildings or shopping centers that have been loaded with tenants, but also I've represented tenants that have had to execute these estoppel certificates. They say, hey, in the middle of their lease, they said, hey, I just got this in the mail from the landlord or the lender, and I have to say and send this back in. And the questions in there are, A, what is your current rent payment? What is the security deposit that you have paid? Have you paid any other amounts in advance? And also, are you or the landlord in default of any other obligations under that lease? And so therefore, why is that important? New buyer comes in, just as you were saying, maybe it forgot to be discussed in the sales transaction, or overlooked, or the inspection wasn't completed thoroughly enough. But the outgoing seller failed to mention that he took a whole year's worth of rent up front in concession for a lower monthly payment overall, or he has not repaired damages from a water leak that needed amends. And the new guy coming in doesn't catch it, is going to be responsible for it, because you're assuming that new lease, you have that quiet enjoyment clause in the lease, and you have to basically fix all of that stuff. And so therefore, this is just, in essence, hey, Mr. Seller, thanks for telling me everything you know. I'm still going to go and get the tenant's word for it, and vice versa.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, from the tenant's perspective, this is a potential bite at the apple, because oftentimes in the estoppel certificate, it will ask the tenant, "Are you aware of any matters that are currently a landlord default or could rise to the level of a landlord default?" This is the tenant's opportunity. If there's a potential issue or concern, a lot of times they can put in a statement that says, we have a leak. We've given notice of the leak to the landlord. The landlord has 10 days left on its cure period to fix it.
Right.
But it's the ability to give everybody heads up that, hey, we still have kind of a pending issue here we need to take care of. So there are some benefits to the tenant as they go through that estoppel. The things to watch out for as a tenant in the estoppel is you want to make sure that the comments that are being requested or the statements that are being requested for you to affirm are factual. They're things that you can easily state with clarity. For example, security deposit is X. My lease term expires in 6 months on December 30th, 2021.
Not things like how is your business doing, or how do you regard the shopping center in general, or the
Correct.
yeah.
Correct. Yeah, the estoppel should really be based solely on factual things that you can certify. The other thing that you have to watch out for is oftentimes, I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but sometimes people will try to use the estoppel to change the terms slightly of the lease. So sometimes, for example, someone could say in the estoppel, tenant has no right to assign or sublet the premises without landlord's consent. You need to be careful as a tenant. Go back to your lease and look, because there may be situations where you can assign or sublet, for example, to an affiliate or some other entity that buys all of your assets. So make sure that when you're signing that estoppel, there's nothing in there that you see as potential gotcha that may be different than the lease. Because if it's different than the lease, those other people that get that estoppel from you are going to point to the estoppel and say, no, this is what you said.
Right.
So we're relying on the estoppel.
And generally, these are going to be notarized documents where you're going to have to use a notary, stamp it, send it back. Your lease calls for you to respond to those within a certain period of time, generally a week or two, maybe at the most. So, I mean, they are official documents. Let's talk about, so that's from a purchase and tenant standpoint. Talk about it from a loan and maybe a banking standpoint. Where would this come into play?
Same concept. For example, I represent a bank that does loans to nationally, well, the loan is to the owner of the property, but the tenant of the property is a nationally recognized entity. So, for example, Walgreens.
Okay, yeah, like a
So
triple net investment.
We call it a single tenant lease transaction.
Right.
When we are representing the bank, ultimately we're underwriting the income from the rent. We give some credence to the borrower's financial wherewithal, but we're really focused on the income stream coming from the lease. So we want, in my example of Walgreens, we're underwriting predominantly what is Walgreens paying each month, what are their additional triple net expenses or other expenses that Walgreens is covering. So as we're underwriting that deal for the bank wants to know, does Walgreens have any issues or concerns with this property or with its landlord, which is going to be our bank's borrower?
Right.
And so we require the estoppel from the tenant as part of just standard lender diligence,
right,
for the tenant to give us affirmations. And we always have the estoppel addressed not only to the landlord in that situation, but we also have the estoppel addressed to the lender. So both parties can rely on the affirmations that are being made by the tenant in the estoppel.
And how we've gotten here, I would guess, the reason for this document is maybe someone wasn't forthright, or someone made an honest mistake and somebody made a loan to somebody to buy a property and it wasn't as it was stated, right? So somebody backed up and said, all right, well, next time, let's talk to every one of the tenants. Let's make sure everything's being stated correctly. Let's make sure there's no amendments that aren't being, floated around out there. And then, on the borrower side, in that example, let's go ahead and communicate with the tenant as well to make sure that they are indeed leasing that space, that they are indeed paying that amount of rent and that amount of term is left, because those can be pretty substantial leases. I mean, if you bought a Walgreens or go even larger, if you bought a Home Depot and Home Depot was your tenant, I mean, you're going to be out, $10 to $14 million to buy that thing, possibly even more depending on where it's at, but large sums of money. And so you want to make sure that everything is as stated, not only from the guy that hopes to get the money, but also the guy that's paying the money as well.
Absolutely correct. And you made a good point. A lot of times the standard protocol in the estoppel is for the tenant to affirm to you, here's the lease, and here are all the amendments or side letters that are a part of this deal.
Right.
Because as either the buyer or the lender, what you're initially getting is the package from the current landlord. It says, okay, here's the loan, here's the lease docs. And what
Right.
you're trying to do is you're trying to have kind of independent verification that what the landlord gave you is the same thing the tenant acknowledges as the same document package that governs the lease. And invariably, there are situations, I don't think it's intentional, but sometimes the tenant will say, oh, no, remember we had a side agreement in 1997, landlord just forgot about. So that it's a good way for you to independently verify for the third party, yes, we have the complete total set of lease documents to work with, and we've reviewed all those lease documents so we can match up apples to apples.
Right. And are there any other scenarios where an estoppel would come into play outside of maybe a purchase transaction with tenants or a loan scenario with tenants?
Sometimes subleasing, sometimes a sublessee
Okay. You have to
will want to
verify that
get,
the lease terms are as
yeah.
stated.
So if you're a potential sublessee, you want to kind of make sure you know what you're stepping into, because oftentimes in a sublease context, you're taking over all of the obligations of the original tenant.
So therefore, in this
So
scenario, you would skip the guy you're subleasing from and go directly to the
you
landlord
would
and
you would
just
try to get
verify the
something
terms.
from, you would try to get something from the landlord to kind of make sure that you have a full understanding of what the tenant has done or not done properly,
Yeah, that's great.
because it's kind of reverse methodology like you just said. So you'll know as a sublessee before I step into the sublease, am I stepping into a good deal or am I stepping into a hornet's nest?
Right. Maybe you didn't happen to get exhibit B in the email from the tenant that said that, oh, by the way, there's a CAM reconciliation that's coming due in February and you're going to owe $600 a month for
Yeah,
the next year or something to that effect.
yeah. So that's a common situation when you're representing a sublessee. You may require a tenant estoppel or a landlord estoppel if you could get one from the
Right.
landlord. Now, a lot of times the landlords don't have an obligation to deliver that, but majority of the times the landlord is going to try to accommodate as long as they're factual statements.
There's probably an angle to try to get them to communicate in that, especially if there's a short amount of term left on the primary lease and the new guy's coming in for, a wanting of longer term, 3 to 5 years. And he ultimately wants to keep them as the tenant after the initial lease expires, maybe something to that effect.
Yeah. One thing you also see a lot of times in lease transactions is, especially with sophisticated tenants, they will indicate, okay, well, if you want us to do an estoppel, that's fine, but you're going to have to pay us a certain type of administrative fee to go through the
Oh
process.
yeah.
So with your larger tenants, let's say a Walgreens or a Red Lobster or a Home Depot, they may build into their lease that they will deliver an estoppel, but they'll have an administrative fee of X amount of dollars to
Probably
deliver it.
$100 or $150 or something like that.
Yeah, it varies by the party that's involved in the deal.
Right.
The other thing you also see that's for the benefit of the party asking for the estoppels, you'll see a provision that says, if you don't respond, Mr. Tenant or Mrs. Tenant, within the time period, then we
And
as the
everything's
landlord
correct.
can basically have a power of attorney and sign the estoppel on your behalf.
Right.
So there's often that provision you see in leases as well.
Dangerous.
Yeah, so you want to make sure if you get one of those that you follow the time frames and get your estoppel back out on a timely fashion, so you don't have your landlord basically doing a carte blanche power of attorney to execute the estoppel on your behalf.
Well, that's a great culmination to the subject of estoppel certificates. If you don't know anything about this or you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to give Rich a call. Phone number 918-586-8526, again with Connor Winters. Rich Marshall, hey, thanks for another great installment. Thanks for the great idea to talk about estoppel certificates. A very often asked question.
I appreciate it, Neil. Have a good one.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate
Bye.
it. Bye-bye.